must have smiled with satisfaction. He had the arrogant invaders trapped like penned cattle. He didn't need to risk his precious cavalry in dangerous melee combat. He could simply sit back comfortably and let his circling archers finish the methodical work. As the sun climbed higher into the Anatolian sky, a new enemy joined the battle that was as deadly as Turkish arrows, the heat. It was midday in early July. The temperature on the exposed plateau was pushing past 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit, but inside a suit of chainmail armor with a padded gambeson underneath. It felt like being slowly cooked in an oven. The Crusaders were literally cooking in their own sweat. Metal heating against skin. Severe dehydration began setting in rapidly, clouding judgment, making limbs feel like lead weights, slowing reactions dangerously. Yet they absolutely could not remove helmets or other armor pieces even for seconds. To expose any flesh for even a moment was to invite immediate death from the arrow storm because the Turkish volleys never stopped. Kilij Arslan had organized his horsemen into a relentless, rotating conveyor belt of death that military historians liken to a deadly carousel. One wave of Turkish riders would gallop forward to close range, release their arrows at devastating point-blank distance, then wheel away to the rear to rest their horses and resupply arrows from baggage trains. As they retreated, a fresh wave immediately took their place without any pause. There was no moment of silence. No chance for the Crusaders to catch their breath or reorganize formations. No respite from the psychological torture. It was continuous, rhythmic bombardment that lasted for 7 brutal hours. We need to understand the physics of this systematic slaughter. European chainmail armor, the hauberk, was a marvel of medieval metalworking technology. It was designed primarily to stop the slashing edge of a sword or battle axe through flexible interlocking rings. It allowed reasonable movement while providing protection, but against the high-velocity puncture force of a composite bow arrow fired from increasingly close range, it had definite limitations. As the Turkish encirclement circle tightened progressively, the firing range decreased from hundreds of yards to dozens. At 50 yards distance, the chainmail generally held against arrow impacts. At 20 yards, the physics changed dramatically and fatally. The heavy bodkin points of Turkish arrows, designed specifically for armor penetration, began to burst apart the riveted iron rings of chainmail. They punched through the padded gambeson underneath and bit deep into flesh. They didn't always kill instantly, but they maimed and disabled. Men were dropping not necessarily because they were dead, but because the accumulated pain of a dozen shallow wounds made standing impossible, made gripping weapons impossible, made fighting impossible. But the true strategic tragedy of Dorylaeum was not primarily the men, it was the systematic slaughter of the horses. The destrier warhorse was the most valuable military asset a knight possessed, worth more than a fortune. Each represented years of specialized breeding and training, and was loved by its rider like a family member. But unlike their heavily armored riders, the horses were essentially unarmored naked targets with large body mass. The Turks knew this vulnerability intimately and deliberately targeted the mounts with systematic precision. The scene inside the shrinking Crusader circle became a chaotic nightmare of thrashing. Screaming beasts. A horse would take an arrow to the flank and rear up violently, bucking its rider off onto the ground where he could be trampled. Another would take a shaft directly in the eye, screaming in a way that sounded terrifyingly human, going mad with pain and trampling the foot soldiers huddled nearby for protection. The pride of Crusader heavy cavalry, the foundation of European military power, was being systematically exterminated without ever striking a meaningful blow against the enemy. Bohemon's order to stand fast and abandon offensive action was the only decision preventing total annihilation, but it required superhuman discipline that went against every warrior instinct. Imagine standing in a shield wall while your beloved warhorse dies in agony beside you, while your brother-in-arms falls with an arrow through his throat, gurgling blood, while the July sun literally boils your brain inside your helmet, and being told firmly, do not move. Do not break formation. Hold the line. The Crusader defensive perimeter was shrinking yard by bloody yard. The dead bodies of men and horses were now being used as makeshift defensive ramparts, corpses stacked to provide additional cover. The Crusaders were no longer functioning as an army in any tactical sense. They had devolved into a huddled mass of desperate survivors, with their backs pressed against the marshy banks of the Thimbres River. The river water was their only lifeline for survival, but it was quickly becoming choked with corpses and turning red with blood. The Seljuk Turks grew increasingly emboldened. Seeing the apparent lack of organized resistance, they pressed their circling formations closer and closer. Their taunts became louder and more mocking. They could smell the panic rising from the trapped Franks. They knew with predatory certainty that the invaders were breaking. Kilij Arslan prepared for the final phase of his perfect tactical plan, the kill. By early afternoon, around 2:00 p.m., the battlefield had fundamentally changed shape. What had begun as a sprawling camp spread across the valley floor had been compressed into a tight, suffocating knot of desperate humanity. The Crusader perimeter was no longer a proper defensive line. It was a desperate huddle with backs against the river. Shields locked together in a fragile shell that could collapse at any moment. This is the phase of medieval battle where military discipline usually collapses completely under psychological pressure. It is one thing to stand in an organized line of battle with room to maneuver and swing weapons. It is entirely another to be crushed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of screaming people, stepping on the bodies of the fallen, because there is literally nowhere else to stand in the compressed space. Bohemond of Taranto was riding along the perimeter on one of the few surviving horses, his voice cutting through the chaos and din. He was the glue holding this shattered army together through sheer force of personality. He knew with absolute certainty that if the circle broke, if even a single gap opened in the shield wall, the Turks would pour through with their sabers, and the massacre would be absolute and total. He screamed at his exhausted men, "Stand fast, trust in Christ, the Lord is with us." But Bohemond was a hardened pragmatist, not just a religious believer. He knew that faith alone wouldn't stop 25,000 horsemen from overrunning their position. He desperately needed reinforcement. He needed an army. Hours earlier in the battle, in a moment of crucial foresight that would ultimately decide the fate of the entire crusade, Bohemond had dispatched messengers on the fastest horses. 2 riders, stripped of their heavy armor to lighten their mounts, had broken out of the encirclement just as the Turkish trap was closing. Their mission was simple but terrifying: ride like demons through enemy territory. Find the main Crusader army under Godfrey of Bouillon, and tell them the vanguard is dying. But Bohemond had absolutely no way of knowing if they had succeeded. Did they get through the Turkish scout lines? Were they lying dead in a ditch with arrows in their backs? Or were they hopelessly lost in the labyrinth of Anatolian hills? For the men and women trapped in the shrinking circle, there was no news, no hope of relief. There was only the horizon filled with enemies preparing for final assault. Here, military history must acknowledge a crucial truth often omitted from traditional accounts. The line between victory and total annihilation at Dorylaeum was held together not just by ironclad warriors, but by people who were never supposed to be on a battlefield at all, the women of the camp. As the sun reached its zenith and the temperature became unbearable, thirst became a killer more efficient than Turkish arrows. A knight fighting for 6 hours in a metal oven reaches dehydration to the point of delirium. His tongue swells. His vision blurs. His cognitive function deteriorates. A dehydrated soldier creates dangerous gaps in the shield wall. He collapses. And when he collapses, the enemy breaks through. This is where the Gesta Francorum, the eyewitness chronicle of the Crusade, written by an anonymous soldier, records a detail often left out of sanitized history books. It tells us that amidst the rain of death, the women of the camp stepped forward into the kill zone. These were wives, sisters, and daughters of the soldiers. They had no armor, no shields, just simple wool or linen tunics, offering zero protection against razor-sharp bodkin arrows falling from the sky. Yet they did not cower in the baggage wagons. They grabbed pitchers, buckets, and water skins, ran to the muddy, blood-streaked river, then ran straight toward the front lines through the arrow storm. Picture the scene. Clearly, the air thick with whizzing shafts, men screaming and dying. And weaving through this carnage are women running directly into the kill zone, carrying water. They brought water to men standing in the shield wall, tipping jugs into the parched mouths of knights who couldn't lower their shields. They brought comfort to the dying, holding the hands of young men bleeding out in the dust so they wouldn't die alone. The chronicler writes, they were bearing water and comforting the fighters. It sounds gentle, but in the context of Dorylaeum, it was supreme heroism. Every trip to the river was gambling with death. Many of them were struck down by arrows. History rarely records the names of camp followers, but their impact was strategically decisive. They provided two crucial things: hydration and shame. Hydration kept knights physically capable of standing and fighting, but the psychological impact was even stronger. Imagine being a Norman knight ready to give up, ready to drop your shield and accept death. Then you see a woman, perhaps your own wife, perhaps a stranger, standing beside you exposed and vulnerable, offering you water while arrows strike the ground around her feet. How can you break formation? How can you run? The bravery of the women shamed the men into finding reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. They stiffened their spines. They locked shields tighter. The line held because the women refused to let it break. Around 2:00 p.m., the tempo of battle shifted ominously. The rain of arrows slackened. For a terrifying moment, there was silence. But it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a predator preparing to leap. Turkish riders, unslung curved sabers, formed dense blocks, preparing to abandon hit-and-run tactics for crushing assault. They would smash the shield wall and push survivors into the river to drown. Inside the Crusader lines, priests gave last rites en masse. Men confessed sins to each other. They gripped swords with bloody hands, bracing for the impact that would end the crusade. Suddenly, the ground began to vibrate. High on the ridge to the southwest, dust rose. Kile Arslan glanced at it, thinking it was more of his tribesmen, but the wind shifted. Out of the haze emerged a forest of lances, the golden cross of Lorraine, banners of France and Germany. Godfrey of Bouillon had arrived with the main army on high ground. The trap inverted. The Turks were now sandwiched between Bohemon's survivors and Godfrey's fresh forces. Bishop Adhemar attacked the Turkish camp from the rear. Panic spread through Seljuk ranks. The disciplined army dissolved into chaotic mob. The Crusaders pursued until nightfall. Approximately 4,000 Christian casualties, mostly horses. Turkish losses catastrophic. The road to Antioch was open, but the crusade would march on foot. Subscribe to Great History for more battles where defensive endurance and accidental relief defeated superior tactics.